Hello, this is Melanie Guralnick, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the March 24th issue of the Toronto Sun on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The first story is Blue Jays Opening Day and the Baseball Dreams of Fathers and Sons by Steve Simmons. I can't think about opening day without thinking about my dad. It connects that way for me. Baseball, the Blue Jays, and my father. It especially connects now, almost 27 years after his passing, with all the celebration and circumstance planned for this 50th season for the Blue Jays. And somewhere, someplace, he's still blaming Bobby Cox for his refusal to pitch around George Brett in the 1985 American League Championship Series against the Kansas City Royals. Dad never quite got over Leon McKay fumbling in the Grey Cup or the Jays not winning in '85. When he was dying in 1999, he had two close friends who would show up every morning at the hospital. They were major executives with companies you would know. And long before there were podcasts, they would hold court, talking about the important issues of the time. Like whether Carlos Delgado ran out every ground ball or whether David Wells needed to lose weight. His buddies were there every day, occasionally interrupted by a nurse or a doctor. But the conversation was almost all Blue Jays all the time. My dad started teaching me about baseball so long ago that I don't remember when he first taught me how to score a game. There were no Blue Jays yet. I learned at Toronto Maple Leafs International League games at Maple Leaf Stadium, at the foot of Bathurst Street. He scored every game he went to, and soon I began to do the same. Baseball was part of our daily language and our summer trips. Our house was full of sloppy scorecards. Before there were Blue Jays, we went to Montreal and watched Rusty Staub in a tinfoil stadium. We traveled together to Boston. I grew up a Red Sox fan as a kid because the Leafs were their AAA farm team, to watch Carl Yastrzemski play. We did car trips to Detroit and saw Denny McLain and this Toronto guy, John Hiller, pitch for the Tigers, always with a scorebook and a pen. Even on vacation, we would go to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and watch the New York Yankees or the Texas Rangers play just down the road. And later, I couldn't call him in the afternoons because he would be home watching the Chicago Cubs game on television. I couldn't call until the game was over. Even dinner couldn't interrupt Harry Carey. Why opening day is so important to me. The day I'll never forget, the kind of day every sports-minded kid would want with their dad, came on April 7, 1977. If that date seems familiar, it's because it is. It was the first Blue Jays game ever, played in the snow and wet turf of Exhibition Stadium. It was freezing when Anne Murray sang the national anthem and freezing when Bill Singer threw a strike to Ralph Garr, the first pitch in Jays history. And that was just the beginning of our day and night together. Everyone who was around 50 years ago remembers the snowy images of Major League Baseball's first game in Toronto, either in person or by the television screen. What people don't remember is the doubleheader element of April 7, 1977. Blue Jays in the afternoon, Maple Leafs playoffs at night against the Pittsburgh Penguins. My father had his own season tickets for baseball, and his company had Leafs tickets. He decided, or maybe we decided, I can't remember which, that we would do the sporting doubleheader that day. Baseball in the afternoon, which he loved, except for the weather. Hockey at night, indoors, a game he didn't care much for. In between, steak dinner at Barbarians, which still is around and still worth the drive to Elm Street. We sat through the two Doug Ault home runs, the home run by Elvis Woods, the 4 hits including a home run by Chicago's Richie Zisk, before warming up over garlic bread. Otto Velez quickly became my favorite player that day, eventually becoming Otto the Swatto. He lasted 6 seasons with the Jays. In retrospect, a lifetime for an expansion cast-off. We left Exhibition Stadium rather elated, shared a steak and some other dishes, and then it was off to the Maple Leaf Gardens for the Leafs and the Penguins, led by Pierre LaRouche and Syl Apps. Doubleheader at Maple Leafs Gardens. The Gardens was like a museum in those days, the hallways full of photographs and history. In those days, the Stanley Cup playoffs opened with the best-of-3 series. This was Game 2 in Toronto after the Leafs won the opener. This was a chance for the Leafs, led by Daryl Sittler and Borge Salming, to close out the series. But the Leafs have been predictable for so much of my life. They lost that night, even though Sittler and Salming both scored, and would need Game 3 to win the series. They lost that night, and my dad didn't care. And I was only momentarily heartbroken, a condition that became common for most Leafs fans. Afterward, I was slightly heartbroken, but mostly elated. Toronto had a baseball team. It didn't matter how bad the Blue Jays were in those early years. This was our team, our toy, my dad's new obsession. The beauty of baseball at any time. A game every day, another new conversation. My dad was alive and well when the Jays won the World Series in 1992 and 1993. 5 years later, he got sick. 6 years later, he was gone. Opening day is now a night game in Toronto. It never should be, and I could hear my dad saying that. But as it gets closer to this Friday against the Nomadic A's, all those baseball days and nights and conversations come flooding back to me. The power of baseball. I had the father of my dreams. Almost 27 years after his passing, he's still so alive in my mind. He always will be. There is a picture of Jerry Simmons, the father of the Toronto Sun sports columnist Steve Simmons. And wow, this guy has a face. Literally looks like a cartoon person. He is adorable. He's wearing this gray cap. He's got short curly hair that's brown, thick brown eyebrows, brown eyes, and this giant grin with these super big cheeks as he's smiling, and just smiling eyes to go along with it. Such a cute guy. Photo credit goes to Steve Simmons Files. There is also a picture of Doug Ault. This is taken in 1977 on April 7th. It's a black and white picture, and he is walking into the dugout, so you see him from behind. He's wearing a white uniform with the number 25 on his back, and he's being congratulated after hitting the first home run in the history of the Blue Jays. And you can see 7 guys lined up. A lot of them look like coaches because they're dressed with a different kind of jacket. And they've all got their hands extended to shake his hand. Photo courtesy of the Toronto Sun. That story was Blue Jays opening day and the baseball dreams of fathers and sons by Steve Simmons. The next story is Better Late Than Never. Toronto cops now ban anti-Israel protests in Jewish Hood by Joe Warmington. It took more than 50 rounds of gunshots fired into synagogues for Toronto police and war breaking out in Iran to do what they should have done 2.5 years ago. But better late than never. Quote, due to the changing security landscape in Toronto in recent weeks, including increased volatility and heightened fear in other communities, demonstrations moving into residential neighborhoods in the Bathurst and Sheppard area presents an unacceptable risk to public safety. Toronto Police spokesperson Nadine Ramadan tells the Toronto Sun. As a result, demonstrators will not be permitted to enter residential streets in this area. And they started adhering to that and enforcing that this Sunday past. This came to light as a result of Toronto lawyer and independent journalist Karima Saad capturing on video the moment police articulated this new rule to the very pro-Palestine protesters who came up to that infamous corner. Toronto Police Inspector Israel or Izzy Bernardo, who Saad called even-handed and professional in her experience, set the terms very clearly Sunday. Are you going to have flags, signs, face coverings, keffiyeh? That's a protest, he explained to the pro-Palestinian collective. If you are walking about your business to get to your car, that's a different story, he said, adding that wearing a keffiyeh in that context is fine. Protesting in Jewish neighborhoods banned by cops. But using a keffiyeh to cover one's face, as one of the protesters who was questioned was doing, is stepping over into this category of protest, and that on a residential street is no longer permitted. This means no more opportunity for anybody to use this as cover to steal mezuzahs from the front door of Jewish homes, or scrawl swastikas on the sidewalk. We are not splitting hairs. If that's a game you want to play, we will have a conversation, said veteran cop Bernardo, who was concise in his language that there are to me no protests on residential streets in the area of Bathurst and Shepherd. And if people don't follow that and take to inciting people that live there, then we are going to have a conversation. This does not mean the people can't protest there. It just means they can't spread out into the neighborhood as many have done for more than 2 years. Lawful demonstrations at the main intersection and along the main streets of Bathurst Street and Shepherd Avenue West may continue, explained Ramadan. This is a targeted response to specific concerns and a measured step to reduce the risk of escalation and maintain public safety. One of the worries post the shooting of 3 synagogues in the GTA is a Bondi Beach-style murder spree like Sydney, Australia suffered. From the first anti-Israel protests in Toronto and Mississauga, post-October 7, 2023, there were many, including myself, who warned that if you give people calling for global intifada and for Jews to be wiped out of Israel from the river to the sea an inch, they will take much more. Under political pressure, police catered to the protest crowd and let them take these corners and streets without permits. Many times, people who stood up to them or walked on the same sidewalk to protest the event were the ones who ended up in handcuffs. Councillor Pasternak complained for years. It appears that appeasement is over. No one is happier than local councillor James Pasternak, who has been calling for this very thing from the beginning of this madness. While this is overdue, I appreciate Toronto police stopping protesters from entering the local Jewish neighborhood to harass and incite local residents, Pasternak told the Toronto Sun. It's about time the charter rights of the local residents are protected, and not just the mobs on our streets. Police should be thanked for this action. There was a lot of politics behind all of this. Over the years, anytime I have a conversation with Toronto police, I emphasize the fact that charter rights are for everyone and not just for the protesters, said Pasternak. What about our rights to go about our daily lives without harassment, intimidation, and incitement? Pasternak would routinely ask, why do the mob seem to have all the rights? This all came to a head when Mayor Olivia Chow told Newstalk 1010's John Moore that Chief of Police Myron Demkiw was being prevented from laying charges because of, quote, a lawyer at headquarters. To which the top cop said this was not true. No one ever got to the bottom of that, but no one can say the new directive is from that same lawyer, because that counselor is not at this time running that department. None of this is rocket science. Protesters of anything should not be able to harass citizens, block roadways, trespass, or go into residential areas or attend places of worship. They should only be protesting on the public square at City Hall or Queen's Park in a public park. But if they try to defy DEMQ on this, there will be no complaining that they were not warned. There is a picture of Rebel News founder Ezra Levant. He is getting arrested at a protest. So there are these guys that are all in black. Black hats, black shirts, pants, gloves. They have this stuff strapped to the front of them that's got all kinds of, who knows what, guns, pepper spray, all that. And so they've got him in handcuffs walking in the street, and you could see a lot of protesters behind waving their hands and flags. Photo credit goes to Mark Wickens. That story was Better Late Than Never. Toronto cops now ban anti-Israel protests in Jewish Hood, by Joe Warmington. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Sun on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The next story is He Massacred 3 at Waterloo Factory. Now he's got day parole, by Brad Hunter. Patrick Dombrowski was a throbbing muscle of fury and resentment. A leather cutter at the Ontario Glove Factory in Waterloo, he had been suspended from work several days before. On February 2, 1992, Dombrowski, 28 at the time, walked into the factory and began shooting. His bullets hit 3 people, killing them. Dying that day were 39-year-old Ontario Glove co-owner Greg Moore, 33-year-old supervisor Larry Strack, and fellow employee 43-year-old Elizabeth Travases. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison in 1993. Granted day parole. Now, 3 decades later, Dombrowski, now 62, has been granted 6 months of day parole in British Columbia, CTV News reports. He told the panel he wanted to stay at a Vancouver Island facility. In 2025, he completed a 60-day unescorted temporary absence, or UTA, last year. Dombrowski is barred from visiting Ontario or having contact with the families of his victims. Quote, "Your behavior during the UTA was described as, quote, flawless, and you were able to practice your communication and social skills and reduce your anxiety," the board decision stated. While your behavior was acceptable on the UTA, your generally introverted and quiet nature is cause for concern in the management of your case. But, as in all homicides, both more recent and historic, pain does not take a vacation. Missing milestones in their life. In one of the victim statements, the daughter of a victim speaks to the grief and loss they've experienced as a result of growing up without their mother and missing milestones in their life, the patrol board decision stated. The board noted that at the time of the massacre, Dombrowski was dealing with the death of his father, the collapse of a relationship, and financial woes. There are strong indicators of you planning your offenses for reasons related to a desire for vengeance, the document said, noting his history of lacking self-control. Believes risk, quote, manageable. There is a history of social isolation, introversion, depression, which led to your struggle to assess conflict, resolve personal emotional conflict, and justifying the use of violence to solve problems, the board added. In prison, aside from one incident with a rock in a sock, his behavior was, quote, appropriate. Dombrowski wants to return to the Vancouver Island facility and would like to find a job in retail or a warehouse. He also wants to volunteer in the community. You advised the board that you believe your risk is manageable in the community and that you will take your release slow, the parole board decision said. When asked by the board how you will be addressing issues in relation to seeking employment and disclosing your offenses, you noted that you had not considered this, but said you would work this through with supports and would be honest in your disclosures. But the panel said it had worried Dombrowski's, quote, introverted general nature may result in any decline in your motivation or other risk-elevating concerns. Those fears have now been tempered, the board said. There is a picture of the Waterloo triple killer, Patrick Dombrowski. It's basically a useless picture because it's an extreme close-up. It's very dark. You just see a profile, like you see a nose, a little bit of a chin, a few tufts of brown hair at the top. You almost can't even tell it's a face. The background is black, but there it is. Photo courtesy of Screen Grab. That story was He Massacred 3 at Waterloo Factory. Now he's got day parole, by Brad Hunter. The next story is Ford Among Premiers Seeking More Say in Federal Judge Appointments, by Brian Toey. Premier Doug Ford has joined 3 other premiers in sending a letter to Prime Minister Mark Carney calling for more decision-making power in federal judicial appointments in their provinces. Ford, along with Alberta's Danielle Smith, Saskatchewan's Scott Moe, and Quebec's Francois Legault, signed a joint letter on Tuesday, which asks for appointments to courts of appeal and superior trial courts, to be picked from a list of names recommended by the provinces. Currently, the provinces have the power to appoint judges in lower courts, but only the federal government can appoint judges in higher ones. As premiers from across Canada, we write jointly to advance reform to the process of appointments to the superior trial courts and courts of appeal of the provinces, as well as to the Supreme Court of Canada, the premiers wrote. We are calling for a new collaborative approach, wherein our governments can meaningfully engage in filling judicial positions in our respective jurisdictions. Ford says giving Ontario more say would be critical to issues such as public safety and bail reform. Ontario deserves a real say in the appointment of judges, making critical decisions on issues like bail reform, which directly impacts public safety in our province, the Premier said on X. Feds say no, but thanks for the thought. Justice Minister Sean Fraser said the selection process works as is, and that the government is not thinking about making any changes to it. Although, he added he welcomes provincial participation in some fashion. Quote, we welcome provincial government's participation in that process, and proactively reach out after we receive recommendations through the judicial advisory committees to test with our provincial counterparts whether they've got information about the reputation of the people we're considering. I found that to be very informative, Fraser said. The premiers also want the same access to information that the federal government has on all candidates, saying such a move would promote, quote, open and cooperative federalism, and would encourage public confidence in the judicial system. Ontario Liberals say no. The Ontario Liberals argue Ford has no business making such a request, adding the Premier wants to politicize the bench. Quote, giving Doug Ford that kind of authority would be dangerous, Ontario Liberal critic for the Attorney General Lucille Collard said in a statement. Judges must be appointed based on merit, independence, and integrity, not political alignment. The Premier has already made clear he wants judges who think like him. Vacancies. Courts across Canada have been pleading for more judges, saying there aren't enough of them to address the number of cases in the system. Canada currently has 42 vacancies, according to data from the Office of the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs. Ontario has 15 of them, the highest number of any province, with 12 vacancies at the Superior Court of Justice and 3 at Family Court. There is a picture of Premier Doug Ford. He is at the podium, and there's a sign on the podium that says Protect Ontario, and then there's some kind of red and blue symbol in the middle, and then on the right it says Protect Ontario in French, at least I think so. And Doug Ford, he's not a small guy. He's wearing a suit and tie. He's got white hair, brown eyes, and he's speaking into a pair of microphones. And there are 3 other premiers behind him. Photo credit goes to John Lawless via Post Media Network. That story was Ford Among Premiers Seeking More Say in Federal Judge Appointments by Brian Toey. The next story is Federal Minimum Wage Going Up April 1 by Brian Toey. The federal minimum wage is set to rise 40 cents on April 1, the government said Tuesday. In a news release, the federal government said minimum wage will rise from $17.75 an hour to $18.15, adjusted based on Canada's annual average consumer price index of the previous year, 2.1% in 2025. The wage is then rounded up to the nearest nickel. Employers in federally regulated industries must pay that wage, or the provincial or territorial minimum wage, whichever is higher. The wage is adjusted every year to keep pace with inflation. Quote, ensuring the federal minimum wage rises with inflation is a floor that protects workers, especially those in the lowest paid jobs in federally regulated sectors. Keeping the minimum wage up to date helps maintain a reliable baseline that strengthens earnings and keeps workplace standards strong for all workers, Jobs Minister Patty Hajdu said in a news release. The federal minimum wage was introduced in 2021 and applies to workers in federally regulated industries such as transportation and banking. Affordability issues. The wage hike comes at a time of increased concerns over the cost of living, with recent data suggesting that Canadians are using their tax returns to cover day-to-day expenses. The data said 40% of Canadians depend on their tax refund to help address cost of living expenses, while 28% use it to pay for everyday essentials. An Abacus poll from December says Canadians believe the cost of living is as bad as they can remember, and they view it as a key policy issue, more so than health care, home ownership, and Canada-US relations. That story was Federal Minimum Wage Going Up April 1 by Brian Toey. The next story is Yelling U.S. Motorist Attempting Ambassador Bridge U-Turn Arrested for Impaired Driving by Pascal Hogue. An American motorist who appeared to have second thoughts about entering Canada was one of 3 impaired driving arrests made by Windsor Police over a 4-hour span last weekend. Shortly after 10:30 p.m. on Saturday, March 21, city officers responded to the Ambassador Bridge after receiving reports of an American driver yelling, honking, and attempting to make a U-turn back to the United States. Windsor Police said Tuesday a vehicle was located and a male driver was arrested, and an odor of alcohol and other signs of impairment were detected. The motorist was transported to police headquarters where he failed a breath test. The man, 34, was charged with impaired operation and operating a vehicle with the blood alcohol content over the legal limit. In a separate incident, officers responded to a motor vehicle collision in the 3800 block of Wyandotte Street, East, shortly after 1 a.m. on Sunday, March 22. Police say officers gave one of the drivers a roadside breath test after detecting an odor of alcohol, which resulted in a fail. The female driver was arrested and transported to police headquarters where she failed a second breath test. The woman, 30, has been charged with operating a vehicle over the legal limit. Soon after, officers responded to a report of a single vehicle collision after a vehicle was found in a ditch in the area of Plymouth Drive at Turingeau Road. Police say officers detected an odor of alcohol and other signs of impairment while speaking with the driver. The female driver was arrested and transported to police headquarters where she failed the breath test. The woman, 22, has been charged with impaired operation and operating a vehicle over the legal limit. The Windsor Police Service reminds all motorists that impaired driving is a serious criminal offense with potentially life-threatening consequences. Affected people in need of support are encouraged to call Victim Services Windsor Essex County at 519-723-2711 or the Victim Assistance Unit at Windsor Police at 519-255-6700, extension 7179. That story was Yelling U.S. Motorist Attempting Ambassador Bridge U-Turn Arrested for Impaired Driving by Pascal Hogue. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Sun on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The next story is Don Cherry's son says Sportsnet wanted apology and more before firing by Joe Warmington. In the days before Rogers Sportsnet fired Don Cherry in 2019, his son said his father was asked to go before the country and participate in what amounted to a humiliating communist-style struggle session to try to keep his job. While the Canadian refused to play their game, it turns out that before Don Cherry was fired from Hockey Night in Canada almost 7 years ago, he was given an ultimatum by Sportsnet executives to read an apology written for him to save his job and take a diversity training course. The revelations come to light thanks to Tim Cherry, the son of the legendary star of Coach's Corner, who was interviewed by the Can't Be Censored podcast crew for an episode that is being released Wednesday on YouTube and Spotify. In the 36-minute conversation between Tim, who produced Don Cherry's Rock'em Sock'em hockey videos with his father, and hosts Travis Donraj and Carmen Wong, Tim said his then 85-year-old father was put in the impossible position by the brass after his, quote, "you people" rant on a broadcast before Remembrance Day. Kept putting the hurdles in front of Dad. Tim said he was approached by two executives who wanted him to try to talk to his dad into providing an on-air mea culpa. The first step they wanted to do is get Dad to read a pre-written, lawyer-vetted apology. And I said there is absolutely no way Dad is going to do that, Tim told Donraj and Wong. Tim said he was told they didn't want this to ruin your father's legacy, to which he replied, "My God, you don't understand. If Dad read this, that would ruin his legacy." Instead, Don went out with his brand and his integrity intact. Sportsnet, meanwhile, fired a legendary patriot on Remembrance Day over a segment about people not sporting poppies to honor fallen soldiers. They just kept putting the hurdles in front of Dad, said Tim. Ron MacLean also thrown under the bus. In the end, according to Tim, they said all he had to do was apologize, when there was apparently a lot more they were asking him to do behind the scenes. Tim said sidekick Ron MacLean was also thrown under the bus, and managers allegedly let him take the wrath of loyal Coach's Corner fans. Sportsnet, the CBC, and MacLean have not yet responded to requests for a comment on Tim's accounting of the firing. All these years later, Tim said the irony of the whole fiasco of the "you people" comment was ridiculous, because "you people" was what my mother Rose used to say to us when she was mad. Tim said his father picked it up and used it for decades himself. What Don wouldn't say on air was a hostage script in front of his fans, while succumbing to these bullies rubbing his nose in the dirt in a cruel way by saying he needed the degradation of going to a politically correct sensitivity class. Interesting scoop by Wong and Don Raj, who left CBC himself after allegedly facing intimidation and attempts by senior leadership to silence him. The CBC has denied those allegations. As for Don, who was recently honored with the Order of Ontario by Premier Doug Ford, he's now 92 and living his best life while getting ready for the Toronto Blue Jays MLB season and the NHL playoffs, where he can say anything he wants in front of his television, and there is nothing those high-priced censors can do about it. There's a great photo of Don Cherry. He is standing in front of the door at his Mississauga home, taken February 4th of this year. He is wearing a white hat that says Canada in red across the top in really big letters. He is doing a thumbs up. He's got a jacket on that's black and it has multiple Canadian flag patches on it. He's got a white beard and mustache, blue eyes, I think, and he's just kind of looking positively at the camera. Photo courtesy of Joe Warmington via the Toronto Sun. That story was Warmington. Don Cherry's son says Sportsnet wanted apology and more before firing, by Joe Warmington. The next story is body cam footage shows neighbor teeing off on Alan Ritchson before beatdown, by Mark Danielle. Alan Ritchson won't face any charges after a bloody brawl between him and a neighbor was caught on camera. Footage obtained by TMZ shows that the Reacher star was wearing a body cam before getting into a physical confrontation with a bystander Sunday in Tennessee. Ritchson, 43, was filmed allegedly beating up his neighbor in front of the Smallville alum's 2 kids after an altercation over a noise complaint spiraled out of control. The new clip shows alleged victim Ronnie Taylor running out into the middle of the street and Ritchson losing control of his motorcycle before the beatdown. Ritchson gets off his chopper and could be heard saying, "Are you fucking kidding me, bro? You're out of your fucking mind, dude. I should have run you over, dude." In response, Taylor accuses Ritchson of riding like a fucking lunatic. "There's kids around here." Ritchson initially walks away and gets back on the bike, but Taylor continues to berate him before things quickly escalated. "Stay down," Ritchson commanded after landing a series of blows that sent Taylor tumbling to a neighbor's lawn. When he was finished getting pummeled, Taylor threatened Ritchson by telling him he was calling police. "That's assault. Assault and battery," he exclaimed. "I'm calling 911. By the way, your assaulting me is all on camera." As Taylor continues to yell, the video then ends with Ritchson driving away. After seeing the lead up to the fight, many Reacher fans threw their support behind Ritchson, accusing Taylor of being the instigator. Imagine being a normal neighbor and seeing Reacher pull up on a motorcycle with a body cam. At that point, just move houses. "You already lost the season finale," one person said of the new recording. "That neighbor provoked the hell out of him and wouldn't stop pushing," a second person wrote, with a third adding, "If Alan Ritchson beats your ass, you had it coming, like this guy did." "He kicked the crap out of me." According to TMZ, which was first to publish video of the purported attack, Taylor said the dispute started when Ritchson was, quote, "flying at excessive speed, revving his engine and disturbing the peace in a well-to-do suburb of Nashville." Taylor said that he asked the father of 3, "Can you fucking stop this, please?" He told police Ritchson, quote, "punched him in the face and kicked him." In an interview published by TMZ, Taylor showed off his facial injuries and described himself as an experienced motorcyclist. "I've been riding bikes all my life," he said. "I heard this incessant revving and speeding through our neighborhood, and eventually saw the guy. I didn't know who it was. I said flippantly, 'Can you slow it down, please?'" Taylor claimed numerous neighbors saw Richson allegedly speeding through their subdivision, and said he took a stand because someone has to. "He rode by once, twice, and on the second time I walked out in front of him and said, 'You've got to stop.' And it escalated quite quickly from there," he said, before admitting that things turned physical after he pushed Richson. "I did push him because he was coming towards me on his bike. I pushed him a second time, and he got off his bike and kicked the crap out of me," Taylor said. "You see, he hit me in the back of the head. I went down to the ground and covered myself. I've had such a shit day today. I don't wish the guy any malice or ill will, but we don't need people riding through neighborhoods like this." Cops say it was self-defense, declined to charge Richson. Richson shared a cryptic Instagram quote after the video went viral. Quote, "Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake," said by Napoleon Bonaparte, the actor shared. He also said he wouldn't be answering questions following the melee. "I can't answer questions about that right now," Richson told the Daily Mail via page 6. But law enforcement sources confirmed that Richson won't face any charges. The Brentwood Police Department, in coordination with the Williamson County District Attorney's Office, has concluded its investigation into the incident involving Alan Richson and Ronnie Taylor on March 22 in Brentwood, Tennessee. After reviewing available evidence, including video footage and witness statements, authorities determined that no criminal charges will be pursued. Mr. Richson's actions were found to be in self-defense. Although a potential reckless endangerment charge was considered, Mr. Richson declined to pursue charges. Brentwood Police Department Captain Stephen Pepin told Postmedia in a statement. With the agreement of the District Attorney's Office, the case is now closed, and no further action will be taken. There's a picture of Alan Richson. He's posing for photos during pace car training prior to the NASCAR Cup, and that was the Series Daytona 500. This was taken in February of this year. You can see behind him there are crowds in the stands. He's wearing a black ball cap and a black shirt with a blue jacket over it. The guy is beefy and handsome. Yeah. Photo courtesy of Sean Gardner via Getty Images. There is also a link to watch the video on X. And so you see Alan is in the street on his motorcycle, and there are two young people, like kids, on motorcycles behind him. And Alan gets off his motorcycle and walks over to the other guy and literally beats him to a pulp on the grass as the kids watch. That is courtesy of TMZ. That story was body cam footage shows neighbor teeing off on Alan Richson before beatdown by Mark Danielle. Moving on now to another story about a bad driver. The story is called "Man Accused of Being Prolific Dangerous Driver Busted by Cops in Brampton" by Brian Towie. Peel Regional Police have charged a man they accused of being a prolific dangerous driver after a traffic stop in Brampton. On March 18, at about 11:45 a.m., police were notified of a prohibited driver allegedly on the road due to a hit from an automated license plate reader near Beauvard and Sunforest Drives in Brampton. The driver was allegedly able to flee from police in a dangerous manner after they attempted a traffic stop. The next morning, at about 8 a.m., officers allegedly found the driver at Sunforest and Wexford Road. In an attempt to escape, the driver allegedly backed into a police cruiser, but was then pinned by other responding cruisers. Further investigation determined that the driver was involved in 3 prior incidents where he fled from police attempting to stop him for observed offenses, police alleged in a news release. In each of those cases, while evading, his behavior placed the public at significant risk. Cops released footage of traffic stop. The driver allegedly had a replica gun on him when he was arrested, police said. Police released video of the traffic stop and arrest, which includes a passenger hopping out of the vehicle, wanting nothing to do with this, and officers commenting on the amount of lollipops in the accused vehicle. Media Relations Officer Constable Ty Bell says in the video that the accused had allegedly mounted curbs, driven into oncoming traffic and onto sidewalks at high rates of speed with no care in the world during prior attempts to flee from police. "Good job, officers," Bell said at the end of the video. Accused also facing immigration probe. Iqbal Dot, 34, of Brampton, faces a number of charges including flight from police, dangerous operation, racing, and possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose. More charges are anticipated, police said, adding that Dodd is also facing an immigration investigation by Canada Border Services Agency. Anyone with information about the incident is asked to contact investigators at 905-453-3311, extension 3710. Information may also be provided anonymously to Peel Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477 or peelcrimestoppers.ca. There is a link on this article to watch the video that the police put out. It's actually done in a really hilarious way. It kind of is self-promoting, but it shows all the cop cars boxing him in and how this guy's trying to ram all their cars, and the passenger jumps out, and the driver jumps out, and they have to tackle him to the ground. And they crack a joke that he won't be able to have lollipops anymore. That credit goes to the Peel Regional Police. That story was Man Accused of Being Prolific Dangerous Driver Busted by Cops in Brampton by Brian Toey. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Sun on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The next story is Toronto Ushering in Cops in Tactical Gear with Rifles by Joe Warmington. Toronto will soon be a city that will see police in key locations, wearing tactical gear and carrying semi-automatic rifles. With the creation of a new, quote, standalone counter-terrorism security unit, Toronto police are not going to just sit around and wait for the city to fall victim to a Bondi Beach-style attack that saw 15 shot to death in Australia in an Islamic State-inspired anti-Semitic terror attack during a Hanukkah celebration. Toronto police are arming and deploying officers to be ready to respond appropriately in case something similar happens here. As part of Task Force Guardian, Torontonians can expect to see Toronto police officers deployed with tactical capabilities, including patrol rifles, Chief Myron Demkew said during a news conference on Tuesday. That is definitely something new for Toronto. But so is having 3 synagogues shot up in the Greater Toronto Area in less than a week. So is seeing the U.S. consulate riddled with bullets, and seeing local Jewish and Iranian businesses targeted with bullets. Police are not going to idly wait for people to be murdered in a mass shooting event. They have decided to get ahead of where this could be going. It's a hostile world now. Tensions around the world are extremely high right now, Demkew said. As the biggest municipal police service in Canada, we are operating within an increasingly volatile national security environment. Global conflicts, extremist ideologies, online radicalization, hostile foreign actors, and heightened polarization are realities that impact both our work and the sense of safety in our communities. Toronto may not be a police state, but in and around the tourist centers, which includes the installations and hotel set up for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, it will look more like one than it does now. Police with rifles is not something people are accustomed to seeing here. What they may see, said Deputy Chief Frank Barreto, are police-issued C8 carbine rifles, carried by officers dressed in emergency tank force-style attire. You will be seeing not only C8s, but protective gear, protective helmets, protective body armor, and things along that line, he said, adding, "We want to deter attacks, strengthen public confidence, and reassure our communities through this highly visible policing model, and be strategically deployed proactively to be able to respond as fast as possible to any threat or violent incident." Barreto added the semi-automatic long guns provide a much better response to deal with threats and neutralize those threats as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. But DemQ doesn't want to see Torontonians panic or be scared. If you see these officers, whether around places of worship or tourist hubs, it does not mean there is an imminent threat, the chief said. What it means is that we are strategically positioning resources to protect our communities and respond quickly if necessary. This is no longer Toronto the good. Yikes. This is not the Toronto we grew up in. This is, however, the Toronto of 2026 that we live in. While this may look to visiting Americans here for the Blue Jays opening night, or for the upcoming soccer event, like an ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement unit, it is not that. It's a Toronto counterterrorism unit. But the message being sent may be to foreign actors who dare to try to harm Canada. We know that visible police presence matters when it comes to deterring violence and reassuring our communities, DemQ said. Certainly, after 9/11, guns in the streets was commonplace in New York City. And even this year, there are armed National Guard patrols all over Washington, D.C. They have to respond to the security threat they could potentially have to deal with, said crime specialist Ross McLean, a former Toronto police officer who said the chief and deputy chief are merely meeting the moment and challenges that the city they protect could face. On March 1, McLean called out for the long guns to be deployed in the city in response to ongoing anti-Semitic attacks and the war in Iran. It's a better safe than sorry scenario. Councillor Mike Cole agreed with that call then and agrees with it now. "I'm glad they're doing something," Cole said. "The world has changed, and you can't be complacent." Cole and Councillor James Pasternak has been calling for more help from the OPP, RCMP, and CSIS to assist Toronto Police with potential terror threats, something Toronto Police Chief Superintendent Catherine Stevenson said will still happen on the national scale. The TPS Counter-Terror Unit is a Toronto-based initiative. "This will be a new standalone unit," said the chief, who said, "With this unit, we will substantially increase the resources dedicated to countering terrorism and violent extremism, supported by robust analytical capacity and dedicated leadership." Toronto Police have made this assessment and are taking preventative action. And you will soon notice that when going to a Blue Jays, Leafs, Raptors, or TFC game, concerts, or World Cup soccer games. There is an undated photo of the Toronto Police Chief Myron DemQ. He is seated at a table with his name on a card in front of him. There's a microphone up to his face as he's speaking. He is wearing a white shirt with a black vest over it that says police. It looks like it's a bulletproof kind of vest. He is an older gentleman that is bald with kind of pink cheeks. And in the foreground, there are two heads of men that are out of focus. photo courtesy of Ernest Doroskuk via the Toronto Sun. That story was Toronto Ushering in Cops in Tactical Gear with Rifles by Joe Warmington. The last story is editorial Feds Gambling with Public Safety by Post Media News. The federal government is sleepwalking into a potential security disaster by failing to do its job to protect Canadians from foreign threats. The latest example comes from a report by Auditor General Karen Hogan. It found that 153,000 international students already in Canada identified by the Immigration Department as possibly failing to comply with their student permits in 2023 and 2024. The department only investigated 4,057 cases, claiming a lack of funding. Of those investigations, the cases of more than 1,600 students, or 40%, were never closed because the students didn't respond to requests for more information. In separate investigations of 800 international students issued study permits from 2018 to 2023, found to have used fraudulent documentation or lied on their application, most applied for other immigration permits, and more than half of them were successful. The potential security threat of hundreds, if not thousands, of foreign students entering Canada under false pretenses raises obvious concerns about national security. So should the fact that the federal government has lost track of 30,000 individuals scheduled for deportation from Canada, some convicted of serious offenses. Meanwhile, almost 9 in 10 rejected asylum seekers in Canada since 2020 are still in Canada. 55,320 out of 63,436, or 87%. Of the smaller group of rejected asylum seekers who have already gone through the refugee appeal process since 2020, more than 8 in 10 are still in Canada. 26,153 out of 31,631, or 83%. This doesn't mean that every failed applicant is a threat, but it does mean that the refugee and asylum system is broken, which raises legitimate security concerns, since faced with a backlog of 300,000 cases, tens of thousands of refugee applications have been approved in Canada solely on the basis of paperwork, without even an oral hearing. That's all the time we have for this story, which was Feds Gambling with Public Safety by Post Media News. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 24th issue of the Toronto Sun. Your reader has been Melanie Guralnick. Thank you for listening.